My name is Hannah Corette Mallory. I'm 38 years old, and the last Christmas I spent in that house, I sat in the living room of a home I legally owned, held a glass of wine I'd brought myself, and listened to my younger sister tell me, with the specific kindness people use when they want you to know they've discussed you, that the holidays had been better since I'd been less present, that there was less tension, that maybe it would just be easier if I wasn't there. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my glass, took one sip, set it back down, and said, okay. What I did next is the reason I'm telling you this story. But before I get there, if you've ever been the person in a family who does the most and gets thanked the least, if you've ever sat in a room full of people who share your last name and felt completely alone in it, I think you already know something about where this is going. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Cookeville, Tennessee, middle of the state, the kind of town where everybody knows your family name before they know yours. My parents ran a hardware store that stayed open because my mother kept the books and my father knew every customer's first name. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. We were the kind of family that didn't discuss money directly, only in the language of sacrifice. Who gave up what? Who needed more? Who asked for less? I was the oldest. My brother Garrett came 2 years after me, and my sister Renata 3 years after that. And I want to be precise about something, because I've had a long time to think about it. I was not treated badly in the ways people usually mean. Nobody hit me. Nobody said I wasn't loved. What happened was quieter than that and took longer to name. What happened was that my needs were the negotiable ones. My achievements were the assumed ones. My presence was the reliable one, which meant it was also the one nobody felt the need to acknowledge. Garrett played baseball. Our family drove 4 hours round trip to games in towns I still couldn't name today. I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm saying I noticed, at 7 years old, that his schedule was the one that organized ours. Renata was the youngest, which meant she was protected in the way youngest children are, cushioned from the friction that the firstborn absorbs like a sponge. And I was the firstborn. I absorbed. By the time I was 12, my father had his first heart attack. Not a severe one. The doctor called it a warning. But in the 2 weeks after he came home from the hospital, while my mother was running the store and Garrett was at practice and Renata was at a sleepover, I sat at the kitchen table and built a notebook. I wrote down every bill, every due date, every amount. I cross-referenced it with what my father had told me we made in a good month versus a slow one. I was 12 years old and I was running a household budget because it needed to be done, and I was the one who was there. I never showed anyone that notebook. I just kept it current for the next 2 years until things stabilized. Nobody asked how things stabilized. Nobody noticed the notebook. And I learned something in that silence that I carried for the next 2 decades. That being capable was not the same as being seen. That doing the work was not the same as being valued for it. I believed, in the way children believe the things their environments teach them, that I was fine because I was functional, and that those two things were the same. They are not the same. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I put myself through Tennessee Tech on a partial academic scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, one at a campus coffee shop, one doing bookkeeping for a small accounting firm off campus that paid me $12 an hour and treated me like I was 40. I studied accounting. I graduated in the top 8% of my class on a Thursday in May when the trees on campus were doing that specific thing they do in Tennessee spring where the light comes through sideways and everything looks like it's lit from the inside. Nobody in my family came. Garrett had a baseball tournament. My mother said she couldn't get away from the store. Renata was 16 and nobody offered to bring her. My father drove 2 hours alone, stood in the bleachers in his good shirt with a handmade sign that had my full name in block letters, Hannah Corette Mallory. And he found me afterward in the crowd and put both hands on my face and said, I see you. I have always seen you. He said it like he knew something I didn't yet. Like he was making a deposit into an account he hoped I'd be able to access later. I cried in the car on the way home. The good kind of crying, the kind that means something landed. He didn't ask me to explain it. He just drove and let me cry and turned the radio on low. That was the first time I understood that being loved by one person clearly is worth more than being half loved by everyone. I moved to Nashville after graduation and built a life that was mine in the specific way things are yours when you made every choice that led to them. I got a job. I got better at the job. I got an apartment, then a better apartment. Then at 34, I bought a one-bedroom in East Nashville that needed work, and I did most of the work myself on weekends with YouTube tutorials and a level I borrowed from a neighbor and never returned. I was not wealthy. I was free. That distinction mattered enormously. For the next several years, I came home for holidays. I brought the banana pudding, my father's recipe, because it was Garrett's favorite and I knew it and I brought it. I bought and wrapped gifts for people who sometimes forgot to get me one. I drove the 2 hours each way and I sat in the house and I performed the version of myself that the family had decided I was. Competent, reliable, a little serious, fine. And I told myself the gap between who I was to them and who I actually was could be closed if I was patient enough. When my father got sick the second time, I did not perform patience. I just showed up. I drove to Cookeville on weekends and managed his medications and took him to his appointments and sat with him in the evenings when the fatigue was bad and he couldn't do much but wanted company. My mother was there. She was grieving in advance, which I understood, but grief does not distribute labor. I was the one who learned the names of his cardiologist, his primary care physician, the specialist in Nashville I got him an appointment with because I called in a professional favor and nobody else thought to try. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years ago. I was there. Garrett arrived 2 hours later. Renata was on her way. When the will was read, he left the house to me alone. The 4-bedroom property in Cookeville where all of us had grown up, with its paid-off mortgage and the detached workshop full of tools my father had handled so many times, the handles were worn smooth. He left it to me because I had earned it in the way people earn things when nobody is keeping score, quietly, completely, at personal cost. My mother's face when the attorney said my name, I can describe it exactly. It was not surprise. It was confirmation of something she had decided to believe before she walked into that room. And that was the beginning of the 3 years it took my family to tell me to my face what they had apparently been saying behind my back for a long time. That I was difficult. That my presence carried weight. That Christmas, the holiday in the house I owned, decorated with lights my brother had strung without asking me, would be happier if I just wasn't there. I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely, because what happened in that living room was the moment I finally understood the full shape of what I had been living inside. Has anyone in your family ever made you feel like your love was the obligation and their comfort was the priority? Like being good at loving them was somehow used against you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Because you are about to watch what happens when someone who has been the easy one for 38 years decides, very quietly, to stop. The night after Renata said what she said, I slept in my childhood bedroom. My name was still stenciled above the closet door in the letters my father had painted when I was 7. Dark green, slightly uneven, the kind of careful, imperfect work that means someone did it themselves because they wanted to. I lay in the bed and looked at those letters and I did not cry. I had cried in that room before, many times, for reasons that would have embarrassed me to explain out loud. This time there was nothing to cry about. What Renata had said was not a wound. It was a confirmation. I opened my laptop at 11:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock in the corner of the screen and registered it the way you register small details when your brain is doing something important underneath the surface. I opened a new document. I titled it Nothing. I started typing. Not a letter. Not a list of grievances. A spreadsheet. Dates. Medical appointments. Expenses I had covered. Hours I had spent. Not because I planned to show it to anyone. I had never planned to show anyone anything, but because I needed to see it in cells. I needed the thing to have a shape I could look at without my own voice getting in the way. By 1 a.m., I had documented 2 years of my father's care in a format that would have been admissible in a court of law. I saved the document, closed the laptop, and lay back down in the dark. The house was quiet. Garrett and Britta were in the next room. Renata was down the hall. My mother was in the room that used to be my parents' room, in the bed that used to be my father's bed, in the house that was now legally, completely, without any ambiguity whatsoever, mine. I drove back to Nashville the next morning before anyone was awake. I left the banana pudding in the refrigerator with a piece of plastic wrap over the top. I took the wrapped gifts. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing to say that the act of leaving before sunrise didn't say more cleanly. The calls started 4 days later. My mother called first, twice. Then Renata, who left a voicemail that opened with the phrase, "I just want to make sure you're okay," in the tone that meant she wanted to make sure I was not okay, in a way that required a conversation she had already scripted. Then Garrett, who didn't leave a voicemail but texted 2 days after that. "Hannah, you know how Renata is. Don't make this into something." I read that text 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on my kitchen counter and made coffee, and stood at my window and watched the street below, and thought about what it means to be told, by the person who has just watched your sister tell you to absent yourself from Christmas, not to make it into something. I didn't respond. Not that day. Not for 2 weeks. What I did instead was call an attorney. Not because I had a plan yet. I didn't have a plan yet. But because I had learned, a long time ago, that when you are dealing with a situation that has a legal dimension, you do not navigate it emotionally. You get information. You understand your position. Then you decide. The attorney's name was Paul Dreyer. He had an office in a brick building off Charlotte Avenue that smelled like old paper and good coffee. I sat across from him and I explained the situation in the same tone I used to present quarterly reports. Here are the facts. Here is the structure. Here are the parties involved. Here is what I want to understand. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was whether there had been any legal challenge to the will. There had not. Darlene had consulted an attorney of her own in the weeks after the reading, but there were no grounds for a contest and she had known it, which had converted her grief into resentment with the efficiency of a system that had been practicing that conversion for years. The second question was what I wanted. I told him I didn't know yet, that I wanted to understand my options before I decided what I wanted. He outlined them. The house was mine outright under Tennessee inheritance law. My mother's presence as a non-paying tenant established no legal right of ownership. I could sell it. I could transfer it. I could rent it. I could donate it. I could do anything with it that a legal owner can do, which is everything, because ownership is absolute in the way that nothing else in a family system ever is. I thanked him. I paid his consultation fee. I drove home. I did not make a decision that day. I want to be honest about that because the story is not about a snap decision made in anger. What happened over the following 2 weeks was slower and quieter than that. It was the process of a person who has spent her entire life making careful, documented, considered choices, sitting with the full weight of what she was about to do and making sure she was doing it for the right reasons. I thought about my father, about the sign with my name in block letters, about the way he had said "I see you" like it was a promise he was keeping on behalf of someone who had failed to keep it earlier. I thought about what he had understood about this family that he had never said out loud, and about the fact that leaving the house to me alone was, in some ways, the most articulate thing he had ever said. He had seen the spreadsheet. Not mine, the one underneath everything, the one that tracked who showed up and who didn't, who sacrificed and who accepted the sacrifice, who had been useful and who had been comfortable. He had seen it. And he had settled the account in the only language that couldn't be argued with. The thing about growing up as the capable one, the reliable one, the one who holds things together without being asked, is that people stop being able to imagine the version of you that stops. They have never seen that version. They have no reference for it. So when it arrives, it looks extreme to them. It looks like overreaction. It looks like you are making it into something. I want to ask you something before I go further, because I think about this a lot. Have you ever been in a position where you finally stopped doing something for someone? Stopped showing up? Stopped absorbing? stopped making it easy, and instead of acknowledging what they'd lost, they acted like you'd done something to them. Like your stopping was the offense, not everything that made you stop. Tell me in the comments, because what I did next was exactly that thing. I stopped. And the way my family responded to my stopping told me everything I had spent 38 years trying not to know. I called Paul Dreyer on a Thursday morning in January. The street outside my apartment was gray and cold, the specific kind of cold that Middle Tennessee does in January where it's not dramatic, just relentless. I had my coffee. I had my notepad. I had made my decision. I told him I wanted to donate the property to a nonprofit organization, specifically one that converted residential properties into transitional housing for families experiencing homelessness. I had researched 3 organizations in the Cookeville area. I had pulled their 990s. I had reviewed their conversion processes. I had chosen the one with the strongest operational record and the cleanest financials because I was not going to make the most significant legal decision of my adult life on sentiment alone. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a generous thing to do." I said, "My father would have done it." And that was true. Roy Mallory had been the kind of man who fixed things for people without being asked and never mentioned it afterward. The workshop in the backyard was full of projects he'd completed for neighbors: a repaired fence, a rebuilt engine, a screen door that had been sitting broken in someone's garage for 2 years. He fixed things. He did not talk about fixing things. He just made sure they worked. The donation would be made in his name. The Roy Mallory Transitional Home. I wrote the name in my notepad and looked at it for a moment and felt, for the first time since December, something that wasn't tiredness. There was one more thing I asked Paul to arrange. Before the paperwork was finalized and the transfer was processed, I wanted a copy of the signed deed sent to one email address: my mother's. No message, no subject line, just the PDF, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in January, opening to her name listed as a non-owning tenant in a property she had been sleeping in for 3 years, believing it was hers by right of presence, if not by law. I want to stop here for just a second because this moment, this specific Tuesday afternoon, is the one I think about when I think about what it means to finally be done. Not angry, not victorious, just done, in the way that a door is done when you close it from the inside and hear the latch catch. If that feeling is landing for you the way it landed for me the moment I pressed send, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happened after that email arrived is where this story becomes something I couldn't have written from the inside of it. And I need you here for that part. The call from my mother came on a Thursday morning. I was at my desk. I looked at her name on my screen and I watched it ring. 4 rings. 5. Then voicemail. Then Garrett. Then Renata. Then Garrett again. I put my phone face down and finished my quarterly report and sent it to my supervisor by noon. 23:15. Claude Respondu. I want to tell you what those missed calls actually felt like, because I think people assume that when you finally stop answering, it feels like power. I want to tell you what those missed calls actually felt like, because I think people assume that when you finally stop answering, it feels like power, like you flipped something over and now you're on top. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a room after everyone has left and noticing, for the first time, how much space you actually take up when you're not making yourself smaller. Quiet. A little disorienting. The specific stillness of someone who has just stopped doing something they had been doing so long they forgot it was a choice. I went for a walk that afternoon. Just around the block, then another block, then down to the park on Shelby where there's a path along the river that I walk when I need to think without my apartment walls holding the thoughts in. It was cold. I had my coat half buttoned and my hands in my pockets, and I walked for 40 minutes without my phone, and I thought about my father. I thought about the workshop, the tools with the worn handles, the way he used to stand at his workbench on Saturday mornings with the radio on low, always country, always old, always turned down just enough that you could hear it, but couldn't make out the words unless you stood still. I used to stand in the doorway and watch him work. He never told me to come in, and he never told me to leave. I could just be there, in the frame of the door, and that was enough. I thought about what that workshop would become. A study space, Paul had told me. The nonprofit had a program where they converted secondary structures into dedicated learning rooms for children in the transitional homes. Small desks, bookshelves, a lamp on each desk. Children sitting where my father's workbench used to be, doing homework with the specific concentration of kids who understand that stability is not guaranteed, and so they hold on to it when they find it. I did not feel victorious thinking about that. I felt something slower and more durable. I felt like I had finally done something with 38 years of careful, invisible labor that was worth the cost of it. My mother left a voicemail the second time she called, 2 days after the first attempt. I know because my phone showed me the notification. I did not listen to it for 4 days. When I finally did, I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and I listened to my mother's voice, thin in a way it hadn't been before, stripped of the particular authority she had always carried in her vowels, saying that what I had done was incomprehensible, that the house was the family's history, that my father would never have wanted this, that she needed me to call her back. She said I need twice. It was the first time in my life I could remember my mother using those words in that sequence directed at me. I set the phone down on the counter. I stood there for a moment. Then I went to my desk and opened a new document, and I wrote down the exact words she had used, in the order she had used them, because I am who I am, and that is what I do. Then I closed the document and made dinner. What I didn't know yet, what I was still assembling from the outside in, was the full shape of what had been happening in Cookville in the weeks since the deed arrived. I heard it the way I always heard things from that world. Through Margene Perdue, who had been my father's next-door neighbor for 22 years and who called me every few weeks not to report, but just to talk, the way older women sometimes adopt the children of the people they loved and maintain the connection out of a loyalty that doesn't require explanation. Margene called me on a Saturday morning in February. She asked how I was. I told her I was fine, and with Margene, fine meant something specific. It meant, I'm upright and functioning, and we don't need to linger here. She accepted that. Then she told me, in the measured way she had of delivering information she knew mattered, what had been happening on the street. The family had not been quiet. Darlene had told the story to anyone who would listen, at church, at the hair salon on Main Street where she'd had her hair done every 6 weeks for 15 years, at the Tuesday morning coffee group that met at the diner 2 blocks from the hardware store that my parents had long since sold. The version of the story she was telling was the one I had expected, that Hannah had taken the house, that Hannah had always been difficult, that Hannah had done this out of spite, out of calculation, out of a coldness that Darlene had always known was there underneath the surface. Margene told me this without editorializing. She just said what had been said and let it sit there between us on the phone. Then she said, half of them believed her. The other half, the ones who knew your daddy, they remembered who drove him to his appointments. I didn't say anything for a moment. People know more than they let on, Margene said. They just wait to see what direction things are going before they say it out loud. I thanked her. We talked for a few more minutes about her garden and the weather and a television show she had started watching. Then she said goodbye in the warm, efficient way she always did, like someone who had somewhere to be but was glad she'd called. I sat with what she'd told me for the rest of that day. The smear campaign was not a surprise. I had known it was coming the way you know a weather system is coming when you've lived in a place long enough to read the sky. What I was still learning to sit with was something more specific, the particular way my family had converted my care into evidence against me. The years I had spent showing up had been reframed, in their telling, into a long calculation. The medical appointments, the spreadsheets, the bills I had paid. In the version of the story Darlene was telling at the diner, these were not acts of love. They were tactics. I had positioned myself. I had maneuvered. I had outplayed them. I want to ask you something, and I mean it, because this is the part that stayed with me the longest. When someone takes the evidence of your love and uses it to build a case against you, when the fact that you showed up becomes proof, in their telling, that you were up to something, what do you do with that? Where do you put it? Drop it in the comments, because I did not have an answer for a long time. And finding the answer is how I got to the next part of this story. What I did with it ultimately was nothing. I want to be precise about that. I did not call my mother and defend myself. I did not send a letter to the Tuesday Coffee group. I did not compile the documentation I had and release it to the family the way some part of me wanted to. The organized 12-year-old part. The one who believed that if you showed people the numbers clearly enough, they would have to agree on what they meant. I had learned by then that people who have decided what the story is do not update their position based on evidence. Evidence is just more material for the story they're already telling. So I did nothing. I went to work. I ate dinner. I walked the river path on the days when the weather was decent and sat with a book on the days when it wasn't. I called Margine on Saturdays. I did not call my mother, my brother, or my sister. 6 weeks after the deed was transferred, the nonprofit sent me a letter. It was on their official letterhead, signed by their executive director, thanking me for the donation and outlining the conversion timeline. They expected the property to house its first family within 4 months. The workshop conversion to a children's study space would begin in the spring. Folded inside the letter was a photograph. The house, taken from the street on a clear winter morning. The Christmas lights Garrett had strung along the eaves were still there. Nobody had taken them down yet. They hung along the roofline, unplugged and still, in the specific way things look when they're waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I got a frame from the shelf in my bedroom closet, a simple wooden one I'd had for years and never used, and I put the photograph in it and set it on my desk next to the one of my father at my graduation. Him in his good shirt, the handmade sign with my name. He was looking directly at the camera with the expression he always had in photographs, not performing, just present. Just there. The two photographs sat side by side on my desk, and I looked at them together and I understood something I had been circling for months. What he had done by leaving me that house was not just a financial decision. It was a statement. It was him saying, in the only language that couldn't be interrupted or reframed or talked over at the Tuesday morning coffee group. I saw who was here. I am recording it. It will be on the document. He had kept his own spreadsheet, and suddenly, sitting at my desk on a Wednesday evening in February with my coffee going cold beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt since the morning of my graduation, when I cried in his car on the way home. I felt held. Not rescued. I had never needed rescuing. Held. The way you feel held when someone sees you accurately, without softening or inflating, just accurately, and says, yes, that is the correct version of events. I pressed my hand flat on the photograph just for a second. His face under the glass, under my palm. I know, I said out loud to the empty apartment. I know you did. 23:17. Claude Respondo. There is a specific kind of mourning that comes after you have made an irreversible decision and lived with it long enough that it stops feeling like a decision. There is a specific kind of mourning that comes after you have made an irreversible decision and lived with it long enough that it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like the ground under your feet. That was February in my apartment. I would wake up, make coffee, stand at the window in my socks looking at the street below, and there was no dread in it, no second guessing. The thing was done. The house was Roy Mallory's final act of clarity, and I had honored it by converting it into something he would have done himself if he'd thought of it. I was not at peace in the performed sense. I was not walking around feeling resolved and cinematic. I was just living, which, after a very long time of surviving inside a family system that required me to manage everyone else's comfort alongside my own, felt like an almost unreasonable luxury. I had not spoken to my mother, my brother, or my sister in 7 weeks. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because the silence is the part people misunderstand. They assume it felt like grief, like a loss you're pushing through. And there was some of that, underneath, in the place where the 12-year-old girl with the budget notebook still lived. She still missed the family she had been trying to manufacture out of the one she actually had. But the dominant feeling was not grief. It was something closer to the relief of putting down something heavy you had been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. Margine called on a Saturday in late February. She asked about my week. I told her about a project at work I'd been wrestling with, a presentation for a hospital system client that kept shifting scope, and she listened the way she always did, with the full attention of a person who has decided that what you are saying matters, which is rarer than it sounds. Then she told me what she'd heard. Garrett had gone to see the house. He'd driven over on a weekday afternoon, according to Margine, and stood in the driveway for a long time. The nonprofit's intake coordinator had been there doing an initial walkthrough. Margine had watched from her front window, not with any particular secrecy, just the natural surveillance of someone who has spent 22 years paying attention to the street she lives on. She said Garrett had stood at the end of the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the house for a long time. Then he'd gotten back in his truck and driven away. He did not go inside. He did not speak to the coordinator. He just looked. I thought about that for the rest of the day. Garrett standing in the driveway of our childhood home, looking at it the way you look at something that has already become something else. I did not feel satisfied by that image. I felt something more complicated. The specific tiredness of someone who has watched a person they love refuse over and over to be who they were capable of being, and has finally accepted that the refusal is the truth of them. He had been capable of more. He had always been capable of more. That was the part that cost something. The weeks that followed had a specific texture that I want to describe accurately because it mattered. I was not just waiting. I was preparing, though I didn't have a word for it yet, and the preparation didn't look like preparation from the outside. It looked like living. I went to work. I had dinner with a friend from my office, a woman named Priya who knew the outline of the family situation and had the particular quality of asking exactly one question and then letting you answer as much or as little as you chose. I ran on the trail along the river on Saturday mornings when the weather was tolerable. I cooked real dinners instead of the efficient, sad person meals I'd been making in December. And I thought. I thought carefully and at length about what I knew, what I could prove, and what I was willing to do with both. Because there was one thing I had not yet done. One conversation I had not yet had. And I had been circling it the way you circle something you know you have to walk toward eventually. Not out of avoidance exactly, but out of the need to be ready before you go. My mother had been living in that house as a non-paying tenant since my father died. The nonprofit's acquisition of the property had a transition timeline. The families currently in residence, meaning my mother, had a period of 90 days to make alternative arrangements. Paul Dreyer had communicated this through the proper legal channels. The clock was running. She had not called a moving company. She had not contacted a realtor about rental options. According to Margine, she had not told anyone in her social circle that she was preparing to leave. What she had done, in the 7 weeks since the deed arrived in her inbox, was tell the story. Refine the story. Make the story so consistent and so detailed that it had started to feel, to the people hearing it, like documented fact, rather than one person's interpretation of events that another person had experienced entirely differently. I called Paul on a Thursday morning. I told him I needed to speak with my mother directly, not through attorneys, not through a formal process, in person. I had information she needed to hear, and I wanted to deliver it myself. He advised me carefully. He listed the reasons this was legally unnecessary and emotionally risky. I listened to every reason. Then I told him I understood, and that I was going anyway. He paused. Then he said, "What do you need from me before you go?" I told him. He got it to me by end of day Friday. I printed it, put it in a folder, put the folder in my bag. That night I sat in my living room after dinner, and I thought about the drive. 2 hours. I knew every mile of it, the stretch of I-40 where the hills flatten out and you can see for a long distance in both directions, the exit where we used to stop for gas when I was a child, the turn onto our street where the old maple at the corner had lost a major branch in a storm 3 years ago, and the scar was still visible on the trunk. I thought about my father's workshop, about small desks and lamps and children doing homework where his workbench used to be. I thought about what he would have said about what I was about to do. I thought he would have said, "Go." Say it once. Say it clearly. Then let it be done. I left Nashville at 8 in the morning on a Saturday in early March. The light was the particular pale, thin light of early Tennessee spring, not warm yet, but trying. I drove with the radio on low, the same way my father always drove, and I let myself feel the full weight of the 2 hours instead of distracting myself out of it. I passed the exit where we used to stop for gas. I took the turn onto our street. The old maple at the corner, the scar on the trunk where the branch had been. I drove slowly down the block and pulled into the driveway of the house and sat in my car for a moment with the engine off. The Christmas lights were still on the eaves, still unplugged, still waiting. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She had been watching from the window. I could tell by the speed of it, the way she was already positioned when the door swung open, already composed into the version of herself she had decided to present. She was wearing her red cardigan, the same one from December, as if she had kept it on all winter, or put it back on this morning for a reason she hadn't examined. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had built my budget notebook at 12 years old, the same chairs, the same window over the sink looking out at the backyard, where I could see the corner of the workshop from where I was sitting. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she began. She used the language she had always used, the language of family unity, of fairness, of what your father would have wanted. She said she understood I was upset. She said what Renata had said in December had been taken out of context. She said the house was history, was memory, was not something that could be assigned to one person when it belonged to everyone. I let her finish. All of it. Every sentence. Then I opened the folder. There were 3 documents inside. The first was a summary I had prepared. Dates, expenses, hours. 2 years of care, formatted in the same way I format client reports at work. Clean columns, clear totals, nothing editorial, just what happened and when and what it cost. The second document was a letter from my father's cardiologist, confirming the frequency and nature of his appointments, and the name of the family member listed as his primary care contact on every form in his file. My name. Only my name. For 2 years. The third document was a copy of a bank transfer record. January of the year Garrett was 26. $14,000 from my account to a debt collection agency, routed through my father's account at his request, paid in full in a single transaction. Garrett's debt. Cleared without his knowledge at my father's quiet instruction, from my money, without acknowledgement from anyone. My mother looked at the documents for a long time. She did not pick them up. She read them where they sat on the table, the way you read something when picking it up would make it too real. Then she looked at me. And here is the moment I want to stop and stay inside for a second, because it is the one I had not prepared for. Underneath the cardigan, underneath the composed face and the practiced language, she looked tired. Not angry, not calculating, just tired, in the way that people look when they have been holding a version of a story for so long that the holding itself has cost them something they can't get back. She looked, for just a moment, like my father had looked in the last months of his life. That specific exhaustion of someone who has spent their energy on the wrong things and knows it and cannot figure out how to unknow it. If that moment hit you the way it hit me when I was sitting at that table, that moment of seeing the person behind the person who hurt you and feeling it cost you something even after everything, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because that moment is the one I carried with me out of that kitchen, and it is the one that changed what I said next. I looked at my mother across the table. The folder was still open between us. I said, "I'm not here to argue about what happened. I'm here because you needed to see the actual record. Not the story, the record." She didn't say anything. "I loved this family more carefully than anyone ever noticed," I said, "and I'm done needing you to acknowledge it. But I wanted you to know that I know, and I wanted you to know that Dad knew." I closed the folder. I left it on the table. Then I stood up, put on my coat, and walked out the front door. I did not slam it. I pulled it shut behind me until I heard the latch catch, that small, specific sound of a door closing from the inside, and I walked to my car and I got in, and I sat there for exactly 3 minutes. The Christmas lights on the eaves, unplugged, still. Then I backed out of the driveway and I drove home.